In today's video, we're going to talk about using different types of needles to knit in the round. I've got a little cuff started here, and I'm going to show you how to knit on different types of needles. We'll start with a set of double pointed needles. These are the Addi Flip Stix, and they have a sharp pointy tip on one end, and you can flip it, and it's got a regular tip on the other end, so that's why they call them flip sticks. The other type of needle that I'm going to demo today is called the Addi Flexi-Flips. These are kind of a cross between double pointed needles and circular needles, and they also have a sharp pointy lace tip on one end and a regular tip on the other. And the third option is to knit in the round on circular needles, and for that I'm going to use my interchangeable Addis. So all Addi products today, 3 different ways of knitting in the round. I'm going to start with the double pointed needles. I'm going to transfer my stitches from the knitting needle system that I've got on right now onto my double pointed needles. And to do that, I find the easiest way is just to knit from one set of needles to the other. So I'm going to mount up my stitches on my current knitting needle, pick up one of the double pointed needles, and I'm going to knit in the round. I was doing a rib stitch here, but I'm just going to knit for the rest of my pattern. I have 40 stitches on my needle, and so I'm going to knit 10 stitches onto each of the double pointed needles. It doesn't really matter how many stitches you have on the needles. It's fine to have a different number. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Just checking to make sure I didn't purl while I was talking. 10. Then I pick up another empty double pointed needle. I like to use those sharp pointy tips. You can tell because the paint is worn off a bit more on that end. And I continue to knit in the round, ignoring that first DPN that I put into my work. Okay, so I have 2 double pointed needles. They each have 10 stitches on them. I'm going to now pull the needle that I'm transferring from, I push that into place. Pick up another empty DPN and knit 10 more stitches. Okay, pick up one more empty DPN and knit the last 10 stitches. Except I have 12 stitches here, so just recount and see where I went wrong there. Okay, here's where I started. I put 10 stitches on here, and then on the next one I only had 8. And then I did 10, and that was why I was left with 12. But that's not a problem, I can fix that. Essentially, to knit in the round on double pointed needles, you have 3 or 4 needles holding your stitches. A minimum of 3 needles is required, and so I can have any number of stitches on the needles. The double pointed needles allow me to knit in the round like a tube. And the way that you knit on double pointed needles is no different than knitting on 2 separate individual needles. Notice here I'm holding the needle that's got the stitches attached, and it's the next one to be knit. And I've got an empty needle in this hand, and I just knit, ignoring the rest of the stitches, or the rest of the needles, I should say, that are in my hand. I'm not trying to hold them, they're just holding the stitches, I get to the next needle, I put the empty needle in my right hand, push the needle down that's in my left, and continue on knitting in the round. Now here is the place where I have 8 stitches, and so I'm going to fix that by knitting 2 stitches off the next needle. So now I have 10 on here. Put an empty needle in my right hand, knit the 8 stitches that are on this third needle, plus 2 more from the next needle. 1, 2, that gives me 10 stitches. Put the empty needle in my right hand and knit the last 10 stitches of my round. Now, let's say you lost a needle and you only have 4 to work with. That's no problem. I've got 40 stitches. 40 divided by 3 doesn't go evenly, but 36, 12 times 3 is 36, so I'm going to knit 12 stitches onto each needle, and then the leftover 4 will be on the last needle. Let's try that. 1, 2, 3. There's 10. I knit 2 more from the next needle, so I've got 12 on this needle. That leaves me with 8 on this one, so I'm going to knit all 8 off this needle and then 4 more off the next one. Okay, now I've got 6 stitches left on this one. Put that needle down and continue knitting the 10 stitches off this needle. So this is handy, double pointed needles are handy if you have a pattern that is in your tube and you want to isolate that pattern on one needle. You can do that. You can have half your stitches on one needle and a quarter of your stitches on the other 2. You could have an equal third number of stitches on each needle. You can have as many double pointed needles in play as you want. There's no limit in terms of the number that you can have. So if you were knitting a hat and 4 needles weren't enough to carry the stitches comfortably, you could add a 5th or a 6th needle into your work. So knitting in the round on double pointed needles is simply a matter of knitting from one double pointed needle onto the next. You empty up a needle, put it into your right hand, continue to turn, and just knit around and around and around. Simple. So that's double pointed needles. That's one way to make a tube, such as a sock or a mitten or a hat or a sleeve or the body of a sweater. Let's try the Flexi Flips next. The Flexi Flips come in a set of 3 needles, and like I said, they're kind of like a circular needle. There's a bit of a cord in the middle with 2 DP ends on either side. So 2 of the needles will hold the stitches, and the third needle is used to knit your stitches. So to get set up, I'm going to put half of my stitches, I'm going to knit half of my stitches onto one of the Addi Flexi Flips. Since I have 40 stitches all together, that means I'm going to put 20 stitches on this needle. Just bear with me while I count this out. And the way that I hold this needle is no different than the way you would hold a double pointed needle. You just focus your attention on the needle that you have in your left hand and the needle that you have in your right. Don't worry about anything else. So I've knit 12 stitches, put down my double pointed needle, and I'm going to continue to knit 8 stitches from here. Now it gets a little tight when you're down to what feels like 2 stitches. So in order to keep it moving, push the stitches up on your left hand needle. Let's see what I got here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay, pull those stitches into the middle of your flexi flip. Pick up an empty flexi flip and knit the rest of the stitches. So again, you don't have to have an equal number of stitches on each of the flexi flips, but sometimes it just helps with counting or knowing where you are in your needle sequence. So generally speaking, I would probably split my stitches equally on the 2 flexi flips. But if I was doing ribbing or something that needed a multiple of 4 or a multiple of 3, then I might split them up based on those numbers instead. Okay, so I've knit myself off the DPNs and I'm now on to the flexi flips. So this is like knitting on 2 needles, except you've got that flexible center in the middle, and that's really helpful for knitting in the round because you need to be able to bend that work. So push the stitches up onto the needle, grab your 3rd flexi flip, keep the stitches that are not being knit at this moment on the flexible part of the needle, and just knit from one of the flexi flips to the other. So what you might not see here is that the needle that's in the back is completely bent. I'm holding those 2 needles kind of in my hands. They're out of the way, but they're not poking into my hands. And my knitting needles are just hanging out in my hands as I go. When I've knit all the stitches onto one needle, I pull that into the center of the needle, turn the whole thing 180 degrees, push my next needle tip in, put the empty needle in my right hand, and begin knitting again. So as I said, there's no problem for me to knit in the round using the flexi flips, but I do find it's most comfortable if I put those needle tips kind of in the center of my thumb and forefinger as I'm knitting to keep them from poking into my hand. And the other 2 needles are just dangling. You can hear them hitting the table every now and then as I knit. Of course, normally this knitting would be in my lap and that wouldn't be a problem. When you get to the end of your knitting, pull your knitted stitches into the center, turn, transfer the empty needle to your right hand, and carry on. What I like about these needles is that they have the option of giving you the sharp tip on one end, the lace tip, or a regular tip on the other. The lace tip has a pointier end and a longer taper, which makes it ideal for doing decreases or fancier stitches where you need to poke the sharp end into the stitch, and sometimes it's hard to get leverage on there. The regular tips are just regular tips. And the other thing about the Addi needles that I like. These ones are metal, and I do like knitting with metal needles. I haven't seen any of the Flexi Flips in their other tips like the bamboo Naturas. They've just been metal, but the metal needles are hollow and they do warm up in your hands quite quickly. So if you don't like metal because it's cold, these needles are not, they're not like that. They do warm up really fast. They're nickel plated brass, and the nickel is nice and slick, slides through the stitches quite nicely. Right, so that's knitting with double pointed needles and knitting with the Flexi Flips, which are kind of like a cross between DPNs and circulars. And next we'll move on to circulars. All right, so the next method for knitting in the round that I'm going to show you today is called Magic Loop. In Magic Loop you need a long circular. So I'm using my interchangeable knitting needle system by Addi, and I've got a 32-inch cord attached to a 4.5 millimeter needle, and on the other end of my needle I have a 3.5 millimeter needle. I really like the option of knitting in the round Magic Loop style when you're using interchangeable knitting needles, because you can do this. You can use the needle that you're going to knit with and then a smaller needle for mounting the stitches up, and it makes knitting in the round, this method, much easier in my opinion. So here we were knitting away on the Addi Flexi-Flips, and now I'm going to switch over to knitting on one long circular needle. I'm just going to take the 4.5 millimeter end of my long circular, and I'm going to knit the stitches off the Addi Flexi-Flips. Again, this is no different than any other type of knitting. The knitting needle in my right hand is doing the knitting needle in my left hand is holding the stitches. And I'm knitting myself off one style of needle and onto another. So I'm just knitting onto my long circular needle. So the trick with Magic Loop is that you need a loop. When I get to the end of my first DPN, or when I get half of my stitches onto my long circular needle, I pull that long circular needle through and I bring it around back again. The loop in the cable, in the circular needle, gives me the flexibility to bring my needle around and put it into the next stitch. If I didn't do this, I'd be trying to force this whole thing over. It just, the needle doesn't bend, but the cord does. So you pull the cord through and then continue to knit. I'm knitting the other 20 stitches, or the other half of my stitches, onto this long circular needle. Okay, I'll get rid of that other needle. And now I have all my stitches on one long circular. So you'll notice that I have a nice loop in the cord here. I have my two knitting needles over here, one on either end of the circular needle. And now I push the needle that is about to be knit from into the stitches. I bring this other knitting needle around to knit with, and in order to get it to be in position for knitting, I have to pull on the cord and bring it around to knit with. At this point, I have two loops in my work, and each of those loops is splitting up my stitches equally into two halves. So I just knit across one half, got a little split stitch there. And when I get to the end of that first half, I can pull or push my stitches, doesn't really matter, but I'm going to pull that other needle into position, turn the whole thing 180 degrees, push the knitting needle that I'm going to knit from into place, bring the knitting needle, just pull on the cable a little bit to give yourself some loop, and insert your knitting needle and continue to knit in the round. So it's called magic loop because you can use one long circular to knit a small circumference, and the way that you do that is to allow the cable to pop out at any place, really. It doesn't have to be in the middle. But you allow the cable to pop out to give you knitting flexibility so your needles can point together and enable you to use one long circular. Okay, again, I've knit across half my stitches. I turn the whole thing 180 degrees. Pull one knitting needle, pull the front knitting needle into position, bring the back one out, pull it towards the right, insert it into my next stitch, and continue to knit in the round. Why would you want to do it this way? Well, it doesn't cost you as much money because you're buying one circular needle, and that same needle can be used for a multitude of things. You could make a pair of mittens, you could make the sleeve of a sweater, you could knit a sweater. So I'm using a 32-inch circular needle, and for the body of a sweater this would probably work all by itself to knit the body of the sweater. Again, when you get to the end of your stitches, turn your work, pull, push, pull, and continue to knit. There may be a little bit more of an adjustment at those corners than you might find with double pointed needles, but the advantage of knitting like this is that you have only two needles in play, so you don't have to switch needles as often as you would with double pointed needles. The advantage of this style of knitting over the Flexi Flips is that you don't have to deal with any of those little ends. You only have two needles in play at any one time. And then the other thing that I like is that you can put a smaller circular on one end if you're using interchangeables, and that makes mounting up the stitches so much easier. Like that. All right, next we'll talk about using two circulars to knit in the round. Using two circulars to knit in the round is one of my favorite methods, probably because it's the first way that I learned to knit in the round outside of double pointed needles. So we're going to transition again from knitting on one style of needle to knitting on the other. I've got two circulars set up here. They're from my interchangeable Addi system, and I've put this one on a 24-inch cord. When I knit in the round on two circulars, I like to have a shorter cord in play. So I'm going to take my first circular and knit half the stitches from my sample onto one circular. When I get half my stitches onto one circular, I pull that circular through and let it rest, turn my work around, and move these stitches onto the next needle for knitting. Pick up my second circular here, and knit my stitches onto the second circular. rid of that long circular. Now I've got my stitches on 2 circulars. So I like this because there's lots of flexibility in here. This was a sleeve, I could try it on as I'm going on. And I've got 2 circulars going here. So if you have fixed circulars, or if you have lots of short circulars and you want to knit this way, this is definitely a viable option for knitting in the round as well. So knitting in the round on 2 circulars works like this. Mount up the stitches that you're about to knit on one end of your circular needle. Bring your hand around and find the other end of the same needle. So you don't want to knit, you're not knitting from one needle to the other, transferring needles all the time. You're always knitting from one end of the knitting needle to the other end of the knitting needle. So I bring that other end around, tilt my work so that it's facing me, and knit. Some people like to use 2 different lengths of needles, like a 24-inch and a 16-inch needle, or a 24-inch and a 32-inch needle, in order to differentiate between the 2 needles. But my method is just to make sure that I'm using the other end of the same needle when I knit in the round. When I get to the end of my round, I like this because it's so simple. I just pull this needle to rest, turn the whole thing around, and pull up the needle that's about to be, pull up the stitches and mount them onto the needle that's about to be knit. I make sure that I'm using the other end of the same needle, insert into the stitch, and start knitting. So half the stitches are being knit on one circular needle, and the other half of the stitches are being knit on the other circular needle. These 2 needles are the same size, and you don't need to buy, if you've got an interchangeable knitting needle system, you don't need to buy extra tips in order to do this. You just put the needle that you're knitting with on one end of your circular and a smaller needle tip on the other end of your circular, and away you go. So the stitches are being mounted up onto my smaller circular needle, and on the other end of this circular I have the right size for knitting my stitches and getting gauge. And those needles never change position. They're always in the right spot when you come to knit them. So I think this is a bit magical as well. And you just knit around. So I find that because I have 2 circulars and I can just pull one to rest and flip the other one around, that it's actually less time consuming than magic loop in terms of adjustment between the needles. Rest, work. And that's why I like the 24-inch cord as well, because it's a shorter cord, so it takes less time to get everything into position. At the end of my stitches, rest, turn, work. So there's 4 different methods for knitting in the round using various types of Addi needles. I hope you try them all, and then you can decide what your favorite method is. Thanks for joining me on this tour of Addi circular needles and Addi Flip Stix and Addi Flexi-Flips. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below, and I'll do my best to give you an answer. Thanks again. Bye-bye.